With the Harlem Happenings 4 a mere days away, I thought today would be a great opportunity for me to run through the entire storyline of the Harlem Happenings thus far. We're going to jump straight into it, going into the Harlem Happenings 1. The year is 2017. 13-year-old David Hopkins is very, very, very bored when all of a sudden he gets a ring from his friend George wanting to come over to his house. His friend George comes over to his house and they play games and whatnot for a few hours. All of a sudden David gets a phone call from his friend Sean saying he has some very important and bad news to tell them. He says that as they know that there have been a lot of kids going missing recently in Harlem and his cousin recently went missing, David is determined to find Sean's cousin, so they decide to go on an adventure trying to find out why these kids are going missing. Halfway through their adventure, they run face to face with a murderer who would now be known as the Slasher. They go to the police about it, but the police don't do much. However, they do have a case file on the Slasher. The police ask the kids not to explore the case anymore, however the kids are still determined to find out the truth. They go to someone named Donald's house and Donald gives them a lot of backstory on the Slasher. Donald explains that he used to be the Slasher's hockey coach back in the late 90s and the Slasher murdered someone in 2001. Donald gave a key piece of evidence to the murder back in 2001 which sent the Slasher to prison. The Slasher, being Donald's best friend, was furious that his best friend betrayed him, so he escaped prison and came back. However, Donald's son Tom soon killed him, except that's what they thought. The Slasher was on the run once again. Donald has a panic attack and tries to lock up his house as quick as possible, but the Slasher breaks in just before he can finish locking up. David, George, and Sean try to run away. Donald tells David to go upstairs as there are emerald bullets in his bedroom and those might be the only chance they have to kill the Slasher. The Slasher and Donald have their final confrontation before the Slasher finally kills Donald. While George is running out of the house, he trips on a bag, killing him. Sean, on the other hand, gets away and so does David. They get back to the house, mourn George's death and realize that they need to finally make a plan to deal with the Slasher once and for all. They go back to Donald's house, find the emerald bullets and make a plan. They try to find the Slasher, but the Slasher has already found them. They have one last face-off and David finally kills the Slasher by shooting him with the emerald bullets. However, during the battle, the Slasher got to Sean. David has his final moments with Sean and makes sure the Slasher is dead. David goes home and lets the police deal with the rest. It is now 2018 and David moves to Columbus, Ohio with his aunt and uncle whilst the police investigate about the Slasher in Harlem. David has a pretty normal life. On his first day of school he runs into Kevin and John, who they soon find out are late for school. On their first day of school, one of the bullies notices that David is the kid who was involved in the Harlem Happenings, so he draws a picture of the Slasher and shows it to David as a form of bullying. We see in the movie that David is beginning to evolve a slight bit of PTSD. David, Kevin and John have a talk in the yard that day about the tragic events of the year before. Kevin and John reassure David that it won't happen again and that they will always be by his side. A day later, on his way to school, John sees the Slasher in the park. He tells David about it in school. David doesn't quite believe him, but when he goes home, he sees a news report saying that there has been a murder in Ohio said to have been the Slasher. David finally realizes, oh no, the Slasher has followed me. In school the next day, the bully of the school, Biff, I know, weird name, has a fight with David, Kevin and John. John and Biff get into a big fight and both of them are sent to the infirmary. The doctor talks to John for a bit, they talk about the Slasher, and then they go home. During the weekend, Kevin and David decide to go to the park where they run into Biff. Biff follows them into the woods, not knowing that they're not alone. Whilst Biff is trying to find them, he runs into the Slasher, getting killed by him. The Slasher looks out into the distance and sees a random civilian who he then kills. The Slasher finds John and stabs him. John spits out blood and the audience is meant to presume that John is dead. Then the slasher and David have their final face-off. The slasher sticks his machete into David's side and walks off. The audience is meant to presume that David has been killed. After a few minutes, whilst the slasher is walking off, David gets back up and runs away. The credits of the Harlem Happenings 2 roll, and the post-credit scene shows John getting up from his deathbed, grabbing the machete and killing the slasher once and for all. John then puts on the mask and says there's a new slasher in town. Now, there was a bit of complications when it came to the actor for John, so that whole new slasher story had to be dropped for the Harlem Happenings 3. It is now 2019, a whole year after the Harlem Happenings 2. David spent 8 months in hospital for his injuries from the Harlem Happenings 2. David is waiting for a taxi to go back to Harlem because he is moving from Ohio back to Harlem. Whilst waiting for the taxi, he has a hallucination of George. He gets into the taxi and he has a conversation with the taxi driver. We now know that David has developed a form of PTSD. David talks to the taxi driver, and the taxi driver brings up a movie about a murderer, which triggers a flashback in David. David gets out of the taxi, goes to bed, and wakes up the next morning to go to school. Whilst David is going to school, he has a hallucination of Sean standing across the road, holding a slasher mask. Sean says to David that he abandoned him. David tries to apologize, but he just runs off to school. That day in school, he makes friends with 2 new kids named Logan and Alex. They make fun of him at first, but then they realize that he was involved in the Harlem Happenings, so they feel a lot more sympathetic. They become friends and they do a bunch of fun stuff over the weekend. The next day, they go to school and they talk a bit more about the Harlem Happenings. Eventually, they see another hallucination, so they go to the doctor. The doctor talks to David about his hallucinations. The doctor books David in for a therapy appointment, and David goes to the appointment. He says everything is fine, and they go home that day. We cut to a shot of a decrepit looking building. Inside, we can see the slasher from number 2. It's John, and he has the machete, but someone bursts through the door. It's the first generation slasher. How did he get in? Who knows? The first generation slasher talks to the second generation slasher, and the first generation slasher kills the second generation slasher. So, the whole storyline of John becoming the new slasher kind of gets thrown out the window here. Later on, David, Logan, and Alex are walking to the park when they run into the slasher for the first time since 2018. The slasher is holding John's head in his hand. He tells David that John tried to take his place in 2019. David is in disbelief. Everyone shouts at the slasher, and the slasher walks away. They run to Donald's house because they still think that Donald is alive, but then they find out, oh yeah, Donald died in 2017. But Donald's son Tom is actually living in the house because he inherited it after Donald died. They get all the information they need, and Tom tells them everything. They leave the house, and on the way home, David sees another hallucination of George. George tells David that all the other spirits are angry at him, but George isn't. George tells David that he needs to finish this, put the souls to rest by killing the slasher once and for all, and David promises to do so. In the meantime, the slasher breaks into Tom's house and kills Tom, leaving nobody left in Donald's family. David goes to the county sheriff and tells him that the slasher is back. The sheriff decides to do some investigating and tells David to go home until they have some evidence. That night, David and Logan have a sleepover at Alex's house until the news comes on. David gets sick in the bathroom because he has another hallucination. The next morning, the sergeant comes to Alex's door and tells him that they found some stuff in the field. They go to the field and see similar markings to 2018. Then, a machete hits the ground beside them and the final battle begins. Alex gets hit by the slasher and they retreat. David and Logan bring Alex back to the hospital and then go back to fight. Logan gets killed by the slasher, and so does the sheriff. David finally tries to take out the slasher by shooting him, but he misses. Eventually, he runs out of ammo and the slasher is about to hit David. Then, he gets shot in the back of the head by a rifle. A policeman comes up behind the slasher and reassures David that everything will be fine and that the slasher is being taken away to prison for the rest of his life. David thanks the officer and goes to the hospital to see Logan and Alex. Unfortunately, Logan dies whilst talking to David, but Alex is perfectly fine. He just needs some surgery to be done on his leg. David says he'll spend the night at the hospital, so he goes home and packs his bag that night. Then the slasher bursts through David's door and stabs him. David is terrified and he questions how he's not dead, and he questions how the slasher escaped. The slasher reminds David that fear never dies. David wakes up to see that it was only hallucination. At this point,
David's kind of sick and tired of the slasher, so he wants to take him out once and for all, and the credits of the Harlem Happenings 3 roll. In the post-credit scene of the Harlem Happenings 3, however, David walks into a gun shop and buys a bunch of guns. The gun seller asks why does he want this many guns. David holds up the slasher mask and says, "I have a hit list." We now have a Halloween 2018 situation. David has been waiting tirelessly every single day for the night that the slasher finally escapes prison. It is now the year 2021, 2 years after the tragic events of the Harlem Happenings 3. David has tried his best to move on from the tragic events, and Alex has still stayed in hospital for a good while. But one fateful night, when the slasher finally escapes prison, David rejigs his plan to take him out once and for all. See you at the premiere.